Tell us a bit more about what you do at New Path Partners for those who might not be familiar.
Sure. So when I was an MD and PhD, I launched a fund out of medical school and started building companies. We built about 20 companies, and those range from gene editing to the current kind of weight loss drugs to cell therapy. And we're really kind of at this renaissance in medicine. As I'm sure most of you have seen, we now have a cure for sickle cell disease that was approved December 8th, and that's going to kind of change the world in terms of gene editing. And I'm sure you're all aware, and we'll probably talk about these weight loss drugs that we worked on that came out from Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, and those are quite transformative, and let's see how the governments behave around those drugs. What we do is we ideate and build companies. So they're ideas of mine or ideas of scientists, and what's super interesting is in the world, there's about 30 scientists since 1988 who have created about 80% of all drugs and all companies over $1 billion. Most of those scientists are in the US, and there's an example like someone like Stuart Schreiber, who founded the Broad Institute and founded Vertex, who himself has made 18 drugs from his lab that are FDA approved, kind of across the world. So it's a very small group.
Is that group growing? Are you inspired by the talent pool?
I think that mentorship really matters. So these scientists tend to be much more entrepreneurial than academics. So I think that number will always be somewhat the same. And in the US, it's actually probably getting smaller because the funding system has become more challenging.
Yes. Might that change in November, for better or worse?
Well, in the US, it's different. The US has the NIH, all you are familiar with. And remember, most companies have a board, of 5 to 8 people. The NIH has a board of 500 Congress people. And so it's very challenging to get funding when each state is fighting over money.
Yeah.
But there are just good scientists. So like if you were to just pick the best scientists and fund them, you would have better and better outcomes. Just like you did during Warp Speed, like we did during polio. Like you just bet on the best people, Sabin and Salk during polio, and the best scientists during COVID.
How is AI advancing the cause today?
I can talk about how it's helping in science. I think the funniest part of the AI in science or in research is the first thing that's actually happened is it's helped eliminate fraud within science. So people publish a lot of papers, right? A lot of scientific papers, and about 50% of those papers are not reproducible. That's in the U.S., and I'm sure it's similar around the world. And if you were to look online right now, you would see that Dana-Farber, one of the best medical research institutes in the U.S., just been plagued by kind of this plagiarism stuff, where the top 2 people there, have really plagiarized work and plagiarized images, and so I think that's going to be the first thing that falls, which is really good. I mean, so I think we'll cull the herd of people who have kind of lied for 20, 30 years.
And when it comes to new and emerging technologies and the breakthroughs of yesterday, how did the two marry? What's the dovetail there?
Well, in science, you guys probably know the Lernaean Hydra. It's like a Greek story where there's a person, kind of a animal, and you cut off one head and another head grows. And almost every discovery that we make comes from something that happened before. So a good example of this is a technology called prime editing. This technology came out in 2019. It actually allows you to rewrite any part of the genome specifically. So you can actually take any sequence, right? We have 4 base pairs, all of us, and each cell has 3 billion nucleic acids or DNA. You can pinpoint and edit one version. And the trick to that technology working is actually understanding the enzyme that causes HIV, one of the enzymes. So that disease is going to end up leading to a cure for a lot of genetic diseases. And so I think that's kind of the aspect that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to sequencing and screening, surely data is what we need more of. And I understand that there have been forays made in the region, not least in the UAE, but also Saudi Arabia. But there are countries that are front runners. Is it Iceland that has screened its entire population? It's making a difference to their healthcare system?
Yes, Scandinavia has been kind of at the forefront here. And most drugs that we have, it's kind of interesting, come from discoveries in that population. So it's a very homogeneous population. The best data set is actually from Finland. So in the 1970s, like the leadership in Finland basically went to their population and said, we're going to take blood from everyone, we're going to take your medical records, and we're going to do that with your kids, do it with your grandkids. And that database became available. And when DNA sequencing became more common, we've discovered how a lot of diseases work. And so in this region, it's the infrastructure to do that that's possible. The money is not the issue. It's the people that, if you get the people that know how to do it and you provide that data, this region has a high amount of genetic diseases. You could actually figure out why those diseases happen. We actually know nothing. We know nothing about folks outside. I mean, even Italian folks we know less about than Scandinavian folks. And as you go further down south, we know less and less.
Is this what's holding us back, holding the global sector back, advancements in medicine, therapeutics, healthcare in general? Is this what we all need to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, if they're all working on it, in Riyadh and in Doha and here, working on ways to sequence their population. The trick is, again, there's a few scientists who really understand how to analyze this data and push it forward. And most of them are doing it, not in a for-profit manner. But you need to have like good organization. And one of the biggest issues that happens in the US and elsewhere is governments are over-concerned with protecting people as opposed to helping people. And we're on our phones giving up data all the time, giving up everything. But we're really worried about health records. They're anonymized, we can get information. And if you don't understand why disease happens, you can't solve it.
That's right. But surely there must be a balance we can strike. We can protect, but also serve. I mean, the two are not, they should be indivisible, right?
Yeah, I think it's completely reasonable to anonymize data, but it's not just the data. It's actually, if you have a disease, you've got to figure out if your kid has a disease. So it's actually thinking in a long-term view, which, my country has failed to do, more recently. You have to think about it, a 50-year time frame. But if you start sequencing people, and you'll actually learn a lot. And there's so many stories about this. I mean, there's a really great example of a drug that's going to come out, I think, from Vertex. And what we observed in the US was that African Americans have worse kidney function. It's actually quite interesting. They report kidney function with different values. So it's African American kidney function and non-African American kidney function. And those values come out. And the question became, why are those values different? No one kind of asked that question. So where slavery was prominent in travel to the US, it was from West Africa. In that particular region, when you go and sequence those folks, they actually have the highest propensity of trypanosomes. About 50% of the population gets infected. So it turns out that population is enriched in the US, and they have a mutation in what's called ApoL1. Now, ApoL1, just like sickle cell disease, protects you from trypanosomes. But if you're in the US and there's no trypanosomes, it causes kidney failure in your 50s. And so that was 2011 when people started looking at that. And now a drug is going to be approved in the US this year, likely that actually solves that. And that's how quick it can happen. So it's asking the right questions as well.
What are you most inspired by? What new breakthroughs or innovations, new paradigm shifts in the sector are you inspired by or intrigued by?
I think the one that's been kind of the most tangible for folks is these checkpoint inhibitors for cancer. When I started in medical school, a metastatic disease, and we've all heard about metastatic disease, they are basically 100% fatal. No one wants to have stage 4 cancer. When Keytruda came out, these drugs completely transformed outcomes. If you had a metastatic melanoma, you had only 5% of people survived more than 5 years. By 2017, within 6 years, it was 60% of those people were still alive and completely cancer-free. Those drugs are amazing, and I think that the issue with those drugs is if you're in the US or elsewhere, you have to go through a certain protocol because we have clinical trial protocol, and you'll be treated with the first and second and third regimen of chemo. But the reality is, for most of those types of cancers, chemo doesn't work. But until we actually have the trials, and we have to actually use this gold standard. So by the time people get to these great drugs that work, their bodies are too worn out to actually take them. And so it's kind of like approaching things more logically. Like if you know that you have a type of disease like pancreatic cancer, and you know the outcome is poor, and you know that chemotherapy doesn't work, we shouldn't be forced to put patients through five rounds of chemo before trying these new drugs.
So that's where policy, regulation, frameworks need to come into play. The government needs to be more involved.
Yeah, they need to partition things appropriately where like the first thing as a doctor is to do no harm, but if a patient has 0 chance of surviving, even with treatment, you should try something different.
Yeah, there's a duty
It's
of
completely
care.
illogical to do the same thing over and over again. And the truth is they actually start to work. The data's coming out now, and these drugs start to work. They actually seem to work in a lot of these diseases, so it's amazing.
This is amazing. When it comes to collaboration and partnership, these are words that have floated to the top in many conversations here at WGS, as always. But what do you see as the runway for 2024 and beyond? What does the landscape look like? Because we talk about it a lot, but is it actually happening at the speed that it should?
I think it's actually happening faster. You just don't see it happening. Like when we started chatting with the region in 2020, like the first thing we talked about was kind of these GLP-1 drugs. You know, they got approved in the U.S. in June of 21. But during COVID, the biggest risk was actually being fat, being obese. No one wanted to say the truth, but these drugs actually would have completely transformed outcomes from COVID. Probably been the most transformative part. And so I think that the biggest thing to actually think about in this region is what can be done that's unique. I mentioned these obesity drugs because everyone knows about them at this point, I imagine. And the biggest issue is manufacturing. What the U.S. is really good at is innovating. I talked about these 30 scientists or so and people who make these drugs, and that's not going to leave the U.S. There may be some arbitrage of those people, but they're not leaving. The intellectual firepower in the U.S. is too high, and the talent within the country is amazing. But there's actually 4 components that change medicine and science. And the other 3, the U.S. is actually not in the best position to solve them. So making drugs, the U.S. Ideating drugs, the U.S. Manufacturing drugs should not be the U.S. We have issues with labor force costs. We have issues with space costs. We have issues with cost of living. And actually the best, most transformative manufacturing facility that made most of the drugs that people took for COVID and that they took for cell therapy actually is in North Dakota, in Fargo. It's a company called Aldebaran. It got bought by Danaher, but they made all the drugs. And so you can see our region, this region here, has a lot of similarities to the Midwest of the United States. So manufacturing is the key here. If you don't make your own drugs, you won't get your own drugs. That happened during COVID. The market here is too small. You know, maybe it's 130 million folks across, GCC and Arab League, maybe a little bit more. I don't know the exact number, but that's not a market that moves anyone. And so you have to take control of your own destiny. And if you can't manufacture high-end drugs, you won't get high-end drugs. You'll just fly to the U.S. and get those drugs. And if you think about it in a way that's logical, you'll be supplying potentially India and Africa, and those populations are growing dramatically. So you got to think about 20 years from now. And I think that the region here can do that better than we can.
When it comes to trust and AI, again, another topic of conversation this morning here, in the field of medicine, therapeutics, so close to all of our hearts, we are either affected ourselves or know someone that has been. How do we get the message out there that AI can be for the greater good in this sector?
I mean, it's already used. I mean, we use these 2 letters, AI, which allows people to raise a ton of money and sound like they know what they're doing. But in reality, in medicine, this stuff has always been used. You know, in the region, they're using it for radiology images. They're using it to kind of improve outcomes. And I think in medicine or science, it'll never be automated. And maybe it will be 100 years from now. But what it will help is it'll help, just like with flying airplanes, it'll help make less mistakes. It'll help us to process images for detecting cancer and MRIs more reasonably. But again, the key with AI is the data set. The scientific data set and the medical data set, at least in the U.S., is 2 partitions, so we can't generate really good results. You need to have a data set that has really good data. And until we have really good data in science and medicine, we can say that we're going to use it, but it's not feasible. The data is it's just crap data.
And to your mind, there's no risk to mitigate? There are no valid concerns then when it comes to development in the AI space and new gen technology?
There's valid concerns, of course, but I don't think we can do anything about them.
We can do nothing about them.
I think that we move forward and we do the best to kind of, I think most people are good actors and you kind of have to move forward and try to protect patients. But eventually, things like Starlink will allow access from remote areas, data will be uploaded, it'll be processed, and in reality, we'll get better outcomes. And it's a question like to the world, like if we had to give up our genetic data, which, 20 years ago cost $3 billion for one sequence, 10 years from now it'll be $100, as right now it's about, 2 to 400. You can touch this thing and I can come and swab that and you have my whole entire genetic sequence. So I don't think it's something that's really defensible against.
We're running out of time, so just a couple of questions to end on. But is it the responsibility of governments to incentivize and facilitate partnerships, at least with academics or private institutions?
Yeah, I mean, that's where government plays the best roles in public-private partnerships. That's where they've been most successful, whether it's in wartime or in vaccine programs like polio or COVID. But it's really incentivizing folks to actually create drugs. Like if you wanted to ask me what policy we could change in the US or anywhere, it's if you make a new drug, like say you actually are the first company like CRISPR Therapeutics to make a therapy in gene editing that's approved. So it went through the process, took from 2012, so it took 12 years to get it approved. It solves sickle cell disease, right? So you get this treatment, sickle cell disease gone, you live. It's expensive, but relative to the cost of the system of that patient. Now I have other editing companies, so those companies now are going to trail in the path of this CRISPR company, and my cost to make a drug is going to decrease dramatically because they paved the way, and they get no benefit for paving the way. So the problem is the innovation actually is stifled by the fact that the first mover is punished economically for making a new drug. So if the FDA gave them more IP protection or gave some grant for getting an approval in a new indication or a new treatment, that would actually incentivize better drug development.
Okay. Just a last word in terms of the entrepreneurs, the startups, the high impact innovators of tomorrow, those working on the breakthroughs that are going to change our lives in the medium and the long term. What excites you the most?
I think that we are going to see really a rapid transformation in the next 10 years in terms of neurological diseases and genetic diseases. I think, for instance, diseases like Alzheimer's and ALS, we understand the mechanism now. I think those diseases are things that will be at least well treated, or a certain subpart will have great treatments, in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's exciting. I think something like Parkinson's is further along. But I think that we really have solved a lot of problems. The people just aren't seeing it. I mean, the fact that we can modify anything in the genome, within 2,000 base pairs and change it, and it works. And you think about disease like Huntington's, and you think about disease like Tay-Sachs. It's going to be like an amazing 10 years.
How do people decide what to focus on? Because often attention is given to ones that are more common, or even high-profile individuals.
It's about, well, there's two things. One is, there's two ways in the U.S. to think about it. One is, how do you get to clinic the fastest? And that used to be what people would go after. So they'd go after rare diseases to get an FDA approval. Yeah. But now, given that the economy has turned a little bit in the last couple of years, now the only focus from pharmaceutical companies and from drug companies is actually market and making money. So you're going to see a pivot from diseases that are a smaller market to only really big diseases because people are looking at the market. And so my point from earlier is, like, if you want diseases solved in the Middle East that are unique to the region, or in Africa that are unique to the region, you actually have to have your own manufacturing. You actually, and your own distribution rights in terms of those drugs. Yeah. But it's not the size that, because obviously TB is like one of the worst diseases. Malaria is one of the worst diseases. There's no market for them, and so they don't get made. Yeah. It's unfortunate, but like there's not a great, I mean, there could be solutions, but it's a longer conversation. But that's the problem. It's the market.
I wish we had more time to continue our conversation, but thank you so much for being here today. We wish you the best of health, and we wish you an enjoyable time at the rest of the summit. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Thomas.